Thank you very, very much indeed for the invitation to share my thoughts with you over the next 30 minutes or so. As Lewis indeed suggested, the concept, the metaphor of metabolism, both as a metaphor, but also as a socio-material practices, has guided much of the research I've been doing over the past 10 or 15 years. To do with you over the next 30 minutes or so is to work through the history, possibilities, pitfalls, and potential future orientations that can be offered by mobilizing the concept of metabolism. And I thought the two quotes that I put here in front of you capture very well, I think, what I try to convey. David Harvey said more than 30 years ago, a thing cannot be understood or even talked about independently of the relations it has with other things. For example, resources can be defined only in relationship to the mode of production and reproduction, what we would today call the mode of existence, mode of social existence, which seeks to make use of them and which simultaneously produces them through both the physical and mental activity of the users. There is therefore no such thing as a resource in the abstract, as a thing that exists in itself. The second quote that I think is vitally important comes from Donna Haraway. It says, a cyborg is a cybernetic organism, a hybrid of machine and organism, a creature of social reality, as well as a creature of fiction. I think these two quotes capture well what I want to say. So the title of my talk is Metabolisms, Symbolic, Imaginary, and Real. There are 6 points I would like to make. First of all, I would like to briefly rehearse what Lewis already has said, the concept of a metabolism, which is so beautifully captured in the German language, Stoffwechsel, the change of matter. It's a much better expression than a metabolism. And as Lewis said, it's the transfiguration of matter. Although much of the emphasis is put on the creation of the new through metabolism, which I fully agree with, it's also a process of destruction. That what was there before is gone. I think that matters. Metabolism is a process of a creative destruction. And I just want to highlight the parallel with Joseph Schumpeter, who called capitalism a process of creative destruction. Metabolism is also one of creative destruction. It destroys and makes anew. And it often, almost always, with a few exceptions, implies forms of displacement. The metabolic process operates over time and across space. Secondly, I want to highlight a bit of the history of the concept of metabolism, which is of course closely associated with the metaphoric concept of circulation, how it evolved in the 19th century, how it evolved from a biochemical, really a physical chemical concept to a socio-ecological one. And that happened in the 19th century. I will then argue that in the 20th century, the concept of metabolism almost disappeared, and to the extent it was discussed, I think it entered the cul-de-sac. In the fourth point, I want to unearth metabolism again in the present context. How can we think of it today, expand the metaphor and its practices for the 21st century? I'll explore that very briefly then, if I have time, to an example. The example of the great prophylactic thing that is being portrayed as the savior of city and planet, the electrical vehicle, and to take that as a kind of case study into considering a metabolism. And if time permits, I want to conclude with a number of key conclusions. Metabolism, I would argue, is the metaphor of modernity. It has been a vital metaphor as well as a vital practice ever since the inception of modernity or of capitalism or of industrialism, whatever you want to call it. One of the first insights was, of course, William Harvey's discovery of the double circulation of blood in the human body. The conceptualization of the human body as a metabolic vehicle, expressed in and through the double circulation of blood in the human body, which is a metabolic process of the intake and the transfiguration of oxygen and and the making of new organic molecules that sustains our bodily metabolism. That was done in the 17th century. And then, of course, I don't have to Germans, I don't have to invoke or pay too much time to Jacob Molschott and Justus von Liebig, the founding fathers, of course, of the very concept. They inaugurated, both conceptually as well as materially, the concept of metabolism. Justus von Liebig, who is the founding father of organic chemistry and who coined the term of metabolic rift, who saw ecosystems as systems predicated upon the exchange of matter, the transfiguration of matter, and the creative destruction of matter, how cycles of death and life were structured in and through metabolic, physical, chemical, and biological, for him, metabolic the processes. And of course, if we think just of planning and design in the late 19th century, metabolic circulation became the mode of organizing advanced urban life. Think of the sanitary city, getting in clean stuff into the city and getting dirty stuff, waste out of the city, which in the UK became known as the sanitary city, but you'd find it across the global north at the time, where a healthy city was considered to be a city that flowed, where there was a continuous metabolic transformation taking place. So what the metaphor and practice of metabolism did was to think the world in terms of flow, change, transfiguration, and transformative circulation. Key notions of the modern and modernity. Of course, by the late 19th century, the biochemical notion of metabolism and circulation became very much extended to understand it as a socio-ecological process. So if we sometimes think that introducing the social into metabolic processes is an invention of the last 10 years, we should think again. This was already in the middle of the 19th century. It was primarily Karl Marx who literally took von Liebig's concept and turned it into a socio-ecological concept, which was for him, for Marx, absolutely vital to understand any mode of existence. So I put here just two of the many quotes that I could have used from Marx. This is on Capital. It's not the unity of living and active humanity, the natural inorganic conditions of their exchange with nature, and hence their appropriation of nature, which requires explanation. That does not need to be explained. That is how things are. What needs to be explained is why for 200 years we insisted on the separation between the two. It's only recently that we begin to take the trivial truth that Marx is pointing here back to its real seriousness. So what really needs to be explained is, why did we fantasize about the possibility of separating the two out? Well, obviously, it cannot be done. The two are intimately intertwined, and that is what Marx is alluding to here. And then the second quote is also from Marx. Labor, and labor has to be understood here in a very generic sense, the kind of human activity broadly understood, is first of all a process between man, and I'm sorry for the gendered notion that Marx mobilized here in the mid-19th century, a process between man and nature, a process by which man and women, obviously, through his or her own actions, mediates, regulates, and controls the metabolism, his words, not mine, the metabolism between him, herself, and nature. Through this movement, he, she acts upon external nature and changes it. And in this way, he and she simultaneously change their own nature. Labeling is an appropriation of what exists in nature for the requirements of humans. Is the universal condition of the metabolic, his word again, interaction between man and nature, the everlasting nature-imposed condition of human existence. Here is Marx, the geographer. Geographers should have heeded that a long time ago, so they would not have fallen in the trap of determinism that was alluded to earlier. So what Marx introduces here, I think, is that metabolic circulation turns nature not any longer into a given thing, but into a history. Natures or not, he says, they become. They are historical. And nature is understood as this kind of fusion of socio-ecological processes. So, to summarize quickly here, the insights from that is that metabolism and circulation, as I described it, is a universal condition of material life. Any mode of existence involves a socio-ecological, metabolic, circulatory relationship. Without that, life is not possible. It takes historically and geographically varying, but specific forms. It's specific in any historic geographical times, but it changes the whole time. And under capitalism, the present mode of existence that we all live in, certainly in the global north, it is organized in and through the forms of accumulation. And here I put the simple formula of the accumulation of capital. That is the self-expansion of money, that is turned into commodities, which are social-physical constructs, a piece of machinery, whatever it is, that is then mobilized in a metabolic transformation. Think about the making of orange juice from oranges, or steaks from cows, or mobile phones from columbine tantalite and other components from nature in order to produce more money. That is basically how the accumulation of capital is predicated upon a continuously expanding socio-ecologic metabolic circulation. So while money flows one way, matter in a socio-ecological configuration flows another way. And I'm sure Alf will say more about that in his talk. Now, this transfiguration of stuff for accumulation's sake, under our mode of existence, not every mode of existence, our mode of existence, is structured, of course, by the relations of ownership. Who owns it and who does not? Who controls it and who does not? It is embedded in social relations between people and classes, ethnic, gendered, it's ethnic, it's gendered, it's class organized. It is structured by particular configuration of distribution. Who can have access or not, as the case may be, to my water here, which is the metabolic output, of course. I got it from mineral water. It's organized through metabolic vehicles, what I and others have called metabolic vehicles, which others call socio-technical systems. A metabolic vehicle, like a piece of machinery or an automobile, a nuclear power plant, whatever. It's always embedded in institutional forms and cultural practices. So in some, socio-ecological metabolism is always socially and culturally embedded in very specific and precise forms. And through that embedding, it produces each time new socio-ecological entanglements while destroying others. It's really important. New things are made, others are destroyed, gone forever. It often externalizes things. It is riddled with tensions and conflict. It's not a coherent, a smooth, self-flowing, autopoietic. It's not autopoietic. It is full of tensions and conflicts. It's incoherent and dynamic. In fact, the very incoherence produces the dynamic. And it's replete with inequalities and struggles. The various social positions within that metabolic configuration are deeply unequal and deeply uneven. They're replete with power relations. Okay.
Excuse me, Erik, could you please change to presentation modes? There is one request, maybe from a colleague sitting at it. That's better. Maybe now he's able to read the
Sorry,
text.
Yeah, okay,
Thanks.
That's all right. So this is about what we knew by the end of the 19th century, although largely forgotten in the 20th century. Indeed, if we look at the way in which metabolism was mobilized in the 20th century, I would argue it entered a cul-de-sac, a dead end. And I singled out two perspectives that mobilized a metabolism in the concept, the metaphor of metabolism in the 20th century, which is industrial ecology. Industrial ecology, which basically fetishized commodities, considered commodities to be things rather than socio-ecological relations. And they understood metabolism and researched metabolism as an ecology of the input and output of flows of matter. A classic example here is the Vienna School of Fischer-Kowalski and her team. Metabolism became seen as a pure accountancy exercise, as an input-output model on a spreadsheet, which could be quantified, but which was devoid of social, cultural, or political content. And of course, the related perspective, very famous in the 60s and 70s, of systems theory and practice, whereby metabolism was seen as basically the interaction of matter between discrete entities and things. It was about the exchange of matter and materials. Both these two perspectives depoliticized and de-sociologized what I call political ecology, or the study of socio-ecological metabolism. So what I would like to move on is to on the one hand, take up again what we've learned in the 19th century, but to fast forward to the 21st century and see how it can and perhaps should be expanded and changed. The kind of things that many perspectives on metabolism have forgotten or ignored. So the first point I want to make is that metabolic circulations are imaginary, symbolic, and real. And I think this triad of the imaginary, the symbolic, and the real really matters. I'm going to start again with a quote from Marx, one that's often forgotten. It says, "A spider conducts operations that resemble those of a weaver, and a bee in the construction of her cells put to shame many an architect. But what distinguishes the worst of architects from the best of bees is this, that the architect arises the structure in imagination before he erects it in reality." So the point I want to make here is that metabolic circuits are always closely associated with the imaginary, with imagining ways of doing things. So what the quote suggests is that there is a relationship that needs to be examined, explored, and excavated between socio-ecological material metabolism on the one hand and the imaginary. Secondly, there's always a gap, and we know that from linguistic and discourse theory, a gap between discursively symbolizing metabolism, to continue with the example of the building, the construction plan of the building, that's an imaginary. The material metabolism and the material or real metabolism. That is, despite the imaginary of a building that stands up, as we've seen in Lewis's earlier little video, but buildings do collapse too. Socio-ecological configurations sometimes disintegrate with devastating consequences. And to use the example of the building again, think of what happened in Miami last week. So the imaginary, that is the idea of the finished building, covers the gap, but always disavows, represses, or forecloses the real. That is the possibility, if not inevitability, of the socio-ecological metabolic circuits to break down, to collapse. Airplanes fall down, nuclear reactors melt, greenhouse gases produce an overheated Earth. I think these possibilities are often disavowed, forgotten. The metabolic process is not always coherent. So that's why I would argue that we should we try to think of metabolic circulation in terms of what Jacques Lacan calls a Borromean knot. A Borromean knot between the real, the imaginary, and the symbolic. Because together with Jacques Lacan, I would argue that in today's world, the production of metabolic circuits is always caught up with desire. What do we want? What kind of socio-ecological metabolism do we want to constitute, to nurture? And which one do we want to make disappear from the surface of the earth? So the symbolic is that what is captured in discourse, in language, in images, in codes, or in formulae. My first few diagrams, my first few PowerPoints that I showed were nothing else than symbolic presentations or representations of metabolism. It was just words. Now, these symbolic representations always embody an imaginary. That is, it's always articulated with and vested in a fantasy. And most of the socio-ecological metabolisms that we know in our contemporary world are replete with fantasies of growth, or development, or accumulation, sometimes cohesion, sometimes justice. And there is the real. That is what escapes or what remains. That is what is not symbolized and what is expelled from the imaginary. That is the relation of social power and inequality, of exclusion, of destruction, which are an integral part of these socio-ecological metabolisms. And in this Borromean knot, in the middle of it, resides what Jacques Lacan calls our desire. What do we want? For example, with respect to climate change, the standard argument is that CO2 and other greenhouse gases or their management is the key to socially just and ecologically sensible society, which includes a transformation of socio-ecological metabolism, which is vested with certain imaginaries and which is discursively captured in particular kind of ways. However, these socio-ecological flows are combined and uneven. Socio-ecological metabolisms are always deeply uneven, and that unevenness is interrelated. It's that unevenness that reflects the multiple power relations along class, gender, ethnic, and other lines through which the metabolic flows are produced, reproduced, and transformed. And those metabolic flows therefore produce differential processes of socio-ecological disintegration in some places and sustainability elsewhere. So let me try to exemplify that very briefly because we don't have time. I could have taken the coronavirus and the COVID-19 pandemic as an example because it's such a terrible, devastating example of a globally organized but deeply uneven socio-ecological metabolic process. But I decided to take something easier that I could do very quickly, just in a few minutes to outline. And I want to take the example of the EV, the electrical vehicle, which is today very much staged as an imaginary prophylactic. So the dominant discourse around electrical vehicles today is that they will contribute to saving the planet from overheating through techno-managerially reorganizing socio-ecological metabolism. That is to nurture a socio-ecological shift, a transition from fossil fuel mobility to electrical mobility. As associated with key names such as Tesla, NIO, Lee, Volkswagen, GM, Toyota, Ford, basically any mobile vehicle producer is invested in that. And I want to illustrate how the symbolic, the imaginary, and the real operates within that metabolic circulation, the process through which an electrical vehicle becomes constituted as an assemblage. So the symbolic is the acceptance and the discourse of the fact of human-made the climate change, which is caused by fossil fuel-based growth. So there is a socio-ecological need to transform the energy metabolism. That transition, the transformation of energy metabolism can be achieved so the dominant discourse go through the production, both symbolically and materially, of prophylactic socio-technical systems. That is new socio-technical systems that will deal with it. And the electrical vehicle is indeed presented almost consensually as such a new metabolic vehicle that will nurture these changes. So the imaginary, the fantasy of the electrical vehicle is that it will contribute to saving both planet and humans from overheating, that it can nonetheless sustain individualized and private and growing auto-mobility, that it will produce more sustainable and livable cities, and that moreover it will nurture economic growth and accumulation through greening, quote unquote, the economy. And it assumes, of course, that a non-fossil based large-scale electricity provision can be achieved in a socio-ecological, sustainable and inclusive manner without basically changing or altering the basic coordinates of the socio-ecological order. The real is that what is disavowed, what is repressed, what is ignored. The first element is the real of the energy situation and the fantasy of the energy transition. This figure shows the energy consumption in the world. There is not a chance in a million years that enough renewable electricity will be produced to fuel a world expansion of electrical vehicles. More than 95% of the world's energy system is still produced by gas, oil, or coal. The electrical vehicle is also predicated upon accumulation by dispossession and land and resource grabs. I put two examples here. Since the electrical batteries upon which electrical vehicles are based require the use of lithium and cobalt, the production, extraction, the making of a resource of lithium and cobalt in Latin America in particular, but elsewhere too, has devastating socio-ecological consequences, is embedded in deep socio-ecological power relationships and struggle, where people's local livelihoods are being destroyed through being dispossessed by huge mining companies that extract the cobalt and the lithium so that our cities and our mobility can become sustainable. And of course, electrical vehicles are full with IT equipment, computers, semiconductors, etc., that need coltan. Coltan is columbine tantalite. And for everyone who knows the geography of columbine tantalite and its infernal deadly resource extraction around, for example, the Great Lakes in Africa, again can see the deeply combined and uneven structuring of the socio-ecological metabolism that produces the electrical vehicle. So what we see consequently is that sustainable, quote unquote, urban transport in one place corresponds with socio-ecological disintegration in another sort of place. And that the ultimate objective of the electrical vehicle, therefore, is to change drastically metabolic flows from fossil fuel to electrical fuels so that nothing really has to change in the socio-ecological power relations. I would argue that these elements or forgotten, ignored, and disavowed in the fantasy construction that sustains the making of a new socio-ecological metabolism that is expressed by the electrical vehicle. So this was just a brief example. If I have 2 more minutes, I want to conclude with a summary of the various components of the political ecology of metabolisms that I summarized in my little talk. First of all, the processes of socio-environmental metabolic circulation transform socio-physical environments and produce new socio-physical milieus with distinct and new qualities while destroying others. There is nothing a priori unnatural, therefore, about produced environments like cities, genetically modified organisms, dammed rivers, or irrigated fields. Produced environments are specific historical results of socio-environmental metabolic processes. Third, all socio-spatial processes are invariably predicated upon the circulation and metabolism of physical, chemical, and/or biological components. Fourth, these metabolisms produce a series of both enabling and disabling socio-environmental conditions. It's not equal, it's not homogeneous, it's never organic. Indeed, these produced milieus embody contradictory or conflicting tendencies. Therefore, fifth, processes of metabolic change are never socially or ecologically neutral. Sixth, social power relationships, which are articulated through these material flows and transformations, through symbolic practices and contested imaginations, shape the particular social, political, and biophysical configurations, and thus the environments in which we live, while often repressing the real of its excessive acting. We don't want to know about the underbelly of the inequalities embedded in these metabolic transformations. So question 7, questions of socio-ecological metabolisms, and this is probably the key conclusion, become hereby fundamentally political questions. Political ecology attempts to tease out who gains from and who pays for, who benefits from and who suffers, and in what ways, from particular processes of metabolic circulatory change. And finally, 8, the political program. Why should we care? The political program then of such political ecology is to enhance the democratic content of socio-ecological construction by means of identifying the strategies through which a more equitable distribution of social power and a more inclusive mode of producing metabolic circulatory processes can be achieved. Thank you very much. I'll leave it with that.